All right, what is up, Utah fans? This is Joseph back with the Utah Utes Football Digest. And today we are talking about our first look at Utah versus Baylor. We're going to go over some numbers. We're going to dive in. We're going to talk about, how Utah can win this game. I don't want to give up too much until we get into the video, but it looks good for Utah, obviously, right? It looks really good for Utah. It looks Baylor fans must be distraught after this past weekend. So super excited, guys. Utah headed to Baylor this Saturday morning game. Lots of fun there. Before we dive in, guys, please make sure you guys like the video. Also, comment down below. I want to hear from you guys. Where do you think the matchups are in the Utah versus Baylor game? Where do you think Utah needs to focus if they want to do really well? Where do you think Utah could get upset? Where do you think Baylor might spring back and pull an upset on Utah? Where could that happen? And then also make sure if you guys haven't, subscribe to the channel. We put out a ton of Utah youth football content. It's me. There's a bunch of other awesome guys that contribute to the channel. So make sure you do it. It's a great time, and we're excited to have you here. And on that note, let's dive into Utah versus Baylor. All right, guys, and let's go ahead and dive in by talking about where both teams are right now. So Utah just came off a huge win at home against Florida. Baylor is just coming off of an embarrassing loss against Texas State. And just to give you guys an idea of what we're talking about here, 24/7 Sports has a talent composite rating every year. And basically, what it is they keep track of all the players that they grade, where they go over time, and where the most talented players are, right? So, how talented is your total roster on your team? And now, this is not the best way to judge a team, but it is a factor, right? It'll let you know how much talent coming out of high school a year or 2 years ago is currently on your team. I hope that makes sense. But I think it also takes transfers into account. Don't think I know exactly how it works, but it is. I trust it pretty well. 24/7 Sports is a site that I trust pretty well. So Texas State is the 93rd team in talent composite, whereas Baylor is the actually, I won't tell you guys where Baylor is yet. I don't want you guys to know yet. I'll talk about that in a minute. But 93rd, Texas State is 93rd, so very low level like talent on their team. And Florida is 15th. Just to give you an idea, for 4 stars, they have 43 4-star players currently on their roster. So this should just give you guys an idea. It's like Utah beat a team that it has a ton of talent, and Baylor got embarrassed by a team that has very little talent. So that's where both teams are as we head into this. I am sure Baylor is not going to look quite that bad this coming weekend. I'm sure Dave Aranda is losing his mind at practice this week, and those players want to go take out their anger on someone and avenge this loss. Baylor's not a bad football program. I'd go as far as say Baylor's a pretty good football program. They won the Big 12 championship, just not 2022, but in 2021. Good team. So they're going to come out. They're going to want to avenge this loss, and they're going to be fighting and scrapping to get it done. So how does Utah make sure that they don't avenge this loss? Now, when we're looking at these two teams, guys, we're still so early in the season that there's not a ton to go off, right? We're still projecting a bit. There's just one game of data for both of these teams. And Utah, looked good, but didn't have their starting quarterback in. And Baylor looked pretty bad against a less than great team in Texas State. So there's a few things I want us to look at. So let's go ahead and follow up on that talent composite we were talking about. We were looking at it for Texas State and Florida to give you an idea of those teams. But Utah and Baylor are also on those lists. And Baylor is at number 46 on that list. So a pretty talented team, above average in talent. and Utah is at 33 on that list. So, you know, getting close to that top 25 in talent. I put us in like the good range, whatever you call it. We've been recruiting well for a while now and looking pretty good doing it. So that's kind of where both teams are talent wise. The other thing that's a big factor in knowing how your team will perform this year is what is your percentage of returning production from the prior year. And so for Baylor, they're 88th in returning offensive production and 80th in returning defensive production, only returning 55% of last year's total production. That's pretty rough. That means you lost half your team, right? And Utah, on the other hand, is actually returning quite a bit of talent. We are returning 83% of our offensive talent or offensive production and 69% of our defensive talent. So, you know, just to give you an idea, just off the bat, and I think if you're a Baylor fan or a Utah fan, you can understand where I'm getting this. Utah looked pretty good in week 1. Baylor looked pretty bad in week 1. Baylor is 46th in composite talent. Utah's 33rd in composite talent. Baylor's returning 55% of last year's production, where Utah's returning about 75% of last year's production. So huge disparities across the board just getting into this thing, right? We're just brushing the surface, but we're seeing some big disparity right off the bat in who should be the better team when we hit the field. Okay, guys, the other number I want to look at is called the ESPN FPI. It's the Football Power Index, and it kind of just ranks teams against the rest of the country based on offensive, defensive efficiency, and just overall projection and resume. So it's got FPI, resume, and efficiencies. You guys can all see that there on the screen. Let's go ahead and take a look. So Utah was boom. We actually moved down a few spots, and I think that's because of how our offense looked without our starting quarterback. But let's go ahead and take a look at it. So efficiency wise, Utah is boom in offensive efficiency. We were 35th at at 66.5 efficiency, so 35th in the country for offensive efficiency. But we looked awesome on defense. We're 12th in the country in defensive efficiency, right? That's pretty good. Our offense will hopefully look a good chunk better in this game, whether it's Cam Rising or whether it's a different quarterback. Hopefully, we'll see a big step up in our offense. Now, let's go ahead and look at Baylor. They're going to be in a little different spot of this list. Oh, sorry about that. I wasn't trying to zoom. All right, so Baylor, down here towards the bottom. Where are they? Here, let me find them. Okay, so Baylor is they're 47th in the country or 48th in the country. They only dropped 2 spots. I find it pretty surprising that happened. Or no, they dropped 21 spots. Sorry about that. 21 spots. And they are let's go ahead and pull them up for efficiencies. This is where they're looking pretty rough. So Baylor for efficiencies, they're almost at the very bottom. So for offensive efficiency, they're 98th with a 30% efficiency rating. And then 12% efficiency on defense for 122nd on defense. That means ESPN has them as one of the worst defenses in the entire country. So pretty rough go for Baylor here. They quite a fall from grace. They were looking like a pretty good team and got smashed by a low-level team in Texas State. I mean, I thought Texas State looked good, but that is what it is. Still very little talent on that team. So that's where both teams are according to the ESPN FPI, which is like, guys, like I can't that none of these things by themselves are to be taken as as gold and that's all you should worry about. But the thing that Utah fans should feel good about and Baylor fans should probably be pretty worried about is how many of these things are consistently stacking up in Utah's favor. We've been over quite a few numbers already, and we'll go over a couple more here in a minute. But that was the ESPN FPI. All right. And then the final numbers I want us to take a look at are going to be last year's stats because we're still only one game in from last year's stats. It's going to be probably about as good as it gets when it comes to defining the teams a little bit. And I'm gonna give two little disclaimers. So one, Utah doesn't have Cam Rising or Brant Keithy. That's a huge deal into how well their offense is going to run. The other disclaimer I'm going to give is what I said earlier about Baylor, how little of their last year's production is returning. So likely these numbers will be worse. They'll be negative from what I'm saying. So let's talk about the first numbers. So Utah last year was 51st in passing yards per game. Now, I also think that number's a little inflated in a negative way where it looks worse than it actually is because Utah had a lot of games where they were up and had to run the ball. Now, Baylor's pass defense is 71st in the country, is 63rd in the country for passing defense. So right about average, where Utah's passing offense is right above average. So I think Utah has a slight edge there. But I would even say a real good edge when you consider why that passing yards per game for Utah is so low. It's really just low because Utah was up in so many games and was pounding the rock. And then Baylor, like I said, 63rd in passing defense. Now for Baylor's passing offense, it is going to be they were 71st in passing yards per game for their offense. So below average there. Utah, and we talked about this last year a lot as I pull up these numbers. Utah was 81st in passing defense last year. But it's a similar situation, guys. It's kind of like when we played Florida. When you're up and you're playing bend, don't break, and you're letting them get yards, short yard completions, so that you can win the game and they're going to milk the clock, it looks worse than it is. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say we got a big edge here. If you watched our freaking defense last week, it looked nasty. It's going to be tough to throw against us. Blake Shapen, if he can play, we got to see if they're starting quarterbacks out this week. But if he can play, he's good. He did pretty damn well last week when you actually look at his numbers. But that was against Texas State. So let's go ahead and let's call it what's it called? A push with our passing defense against their passing offense. I think we have a big edge, but the numbers do say it's about a push. Because you can't when you count, we're 81st, they're 71st. We're probably a little better than that actually says, and they are not returning a lot of production. So I think it's generous to say it's a push. Now, next, this is an exciting one. Utah last year had one of the best rushing offenses in the country. We were 11th in rushing yards per game. Now, again, numbers slightly inflated from being up in a lot of games, but we were a really good rushing team. I think anyone that knows about Utah knows we can run the ball. Baylor was 46th was 65th in rushing defense. So the average rushing defense, and we have a very good rushing offense. We're going to have a big advantage there. That's going to be a big one for Utah, especially when you consider how important it's going to be for us to get a good run game going. Because if Cam's not playing, there's a shot Cam's playing, but I'm still mentally basing all this around the idea that he isn't. And then Baylor's passing yards per game was 71st. Oh, I kept saying 71st for their passing defense. They're 63rd in passing defense. Still a push, though. Everything still applies. So they were 71st in. Oh, wait, no. That still makes sense. Sorry. I got lost there. Baylor was 63rd in passing defense, and Utah was 51st in passing yards per game. So Utah's got a big edge there, plus the returning talent factor, pretty big edge. So Utah, basically across the board, Utah's last year numbers, one was a push in their passing yards per game versus our passing defense. We have a huge edge in our rushing yards against their rushing defense. We've got an edge in our passing offense instead of their passing defense. And yeah, just we look good across the board compared to them from last year. Now they're a different team than last year, but from game one, it doesn't look like that's a good thing. So, all right, guys. So we went over a ton of numbers. We went over the talent composite according to 24/7 Sports of who both teams played last week and how it went. Utah, huge edge there, right? We went over the talent composite of Utah and Baylor, like the actual talent on the teams. Utah edges them out there. We went over the ESPN FPI rankings. Utah, pretty big edge there. We went over the efficiency rankings for the offenses and the defenses for ESPN FPI. Huge edge to Utah there. We also went over last year's numbers, and all but one number that was a push was a pretty big edge to Utah. So there's a ton of advantages to Utah. Now, how does this go? What does Utah need to do to make sure that we get out of there with a win? The first thing is going to be run the ball. We need to run the ball better than we did against Florida last week. And that starts with just, getting in there, getting dirty, and just pounding that rock. Whoever the quarterback is, if they can get a good running game going, it's going to do wonders for our ability to win this game. We have a big edge in our rushing offense against their rushing defense. And I think if Texas State could run it so effectively on them, we should be able to do the same thing. The other thing we need to make sure we're doing is, making the simple throws when they're open. If it's Bryson Barnes, I feel really good about that. He won't be the dynamic run threat that Nate Johnson is, but I really do feel good about Barnes just hitting the open man, making it happen. Where Nate Johnson, I think he'll contribute a ton more in the run game, which will be really beneficial. But is he going to be able to hit those easy throws when they're open? That's not as easy as it sounds. So that's going to be a huge one. If Cam is actually not going to play, those are going to be huge. If Cam is in, I don't even think this game's has a shot at being competitive. I think we'd blow him out of the water. But we just gotta pound the rock. We gotta make it happen. On defense, we need to show that we can hang with them in the pass defense game. I think we'll do just fine shutting down their run game. But when they want to throw and it's 3rd and 10 or 3rd and 7 and they need a first down from the pass, can we make the stop? It felt like against Florida, as much as Graham Mertz's QBR didn't look good, it felt like they were just picking us apart 4 yards at a time. Obviously, it never got him back in the game, but it was just annoying to watch. It was like, yeah, I get it. We're playing bend, don't break, but like, let's get a stop here. Our defense has been on the field for 5-6 minutes, right? So make sure that we do well when in our pass defense. But if we could do all that, I feel confident. We'll do well in run defense, but that's not really the matchup here. I think it's their passing game against our passing defense, our rushing game against their rushing defense. That's who can come out on top of that. And what'll happen is if we can get the rushing offense going, it'll let us control the clock really well, especially with the new rules where the clock just keeps going. So if we could just milk and milk and milk that clock, they're going to start pressing. They'll completely abandon the run game. Baylor will start to make mistakes. And so how do I see this game going? I'm not going to give my a specific prediction for if Cam is in because it doesn't seem super likely. But if he does play in the game, we're going to win big. It's going to be like a 21, 28 plus point win. I really believe that. If Cam is not in the game and it's some sort of hybrid of Bryson and Nate or one or the other, this is where I see the final score. And this is really how I'm feeling. I see the final score 35-21 for Utah. I did think there were some positives from the Texas State game in Baylor's ability to score points with their passing game. They did throw the ball pretty well at times. And this is if Blake Shapen's in. Dude, college football and the injuries, dude, when it's both quarterbacks. If the other guy's in, I think it's a different game. They might not score many points. It might be more like 10 to 14 points. But let's imagine Blake Shapen's in. So yeah, 35-21. I think will score pretty effectively. I think they're gonna have to start pressing to close the gap, and they'll make some mistakes and screw it up. And on that note, I'm going to get out of here, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please make sure you drop the video a like. Also, comment down below. What do you think happens in the Utah Baylor game? I want to know your opinions, your score predictions, what happens. And then also, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, whether you're a Baylor or a Utah fan. We're going to be playing each other pretty often in the coming years. So make sure you guys subscribe, and should have a ton of fun there. Big 12, Pac 12, all you guys subscribe. And outside of that, I'm out of here, and go Utes.